Welcome to CivilNet. My guest is Mark Mullen from Tbilisi, a longtime resident of Tbilisi, on the board of Transparency International Georgia. And for me, most valuable is that he is the editor, the producer, the anchor of a weekly program called TBL Pod. And that is a half-hour program, more or less, in English for those of us who want to follow Georgian politics and other developments in country. Very useful to hear the take of a bunch of expats who work in Georgia, live in Georgia. Mark, thank you for being with CivilNet, and thank you for doing TBL Pod.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm looking forward to the questions.
We're going to talk about the elections, surprise, surprise. Parliamentary elections in Georgia, October 1. Parliamentary elections in Georgia historically have been very significant. And this one, of course, has developed into something really interesting. I know that in Georgia, as in Armenia, there has been this long argument over whether the candidates should be from majoritarian single constituency districts or whether they should simply be on party lists. And in Georgia, as in Armenia, it's a mixed system, although I think that there you have many more from single party constituencies than we do here. How are the party lists looking? Is it really a contest between parties, or is it the individuals who are carrying the election process forward?
Well, the not very satisfying answer is that it's both. I think the lists of the Georgian Dream.
And give us a rundown. Georgian Dream is.
So you have there's two main parties. There's a national movement, which is Misha Saakashvili's party, the ruling party. Before there were a lot of different oppositions, not particularly effective, which the government was quite pleased with the ineptitude of the opposition, and then all of a sudden a billionaire showed up, the 154th richest person in the world, Bidzina Ivanishvili, who has $6 or $7 billion. He united the opposition, as billionaires have a way of doing, and most importantly, the Republicans and the Free Democrats, which are sort of the two most important parties in its coalition. And his list, I think, tends to be a lot of sort of personal allies of him. Actors, sports people, some pretty nationalistic figures. The Free Democrats and Republicans are not as prominent on his list as they could have been. And I'd say the same thing for his majoritarian candidates are not particularly impressive. Some of them are all right, but maybe not what they could have been. And I think that this shows that he expects that after the elections, the two most important parties will probably go their own way if they get enough to form a faction parliament. Of the ruling party, I think their list is a lot of loyalists. It's pretty similar group to have been in the past. There's some very
current bureaucrats, current people in office.
They're the current sort of parliamentary leadership group. I mean, there's not a lot of new faces. The majoritarians tend to be the old majoritarians, including the ones that didn't really do very much. So I think it's going to be a proportional vote where people are actually going to vote for the party one way or another, and then it's going to be the majoritarian votes. People are going to to vote for the individual, and I think that there probably could be quite a number of split votes. Important to remember in this is some of the details of the election law. That this election law was written to favor the largest party in a lot of insidious little ways. For example, there's a 30% threshold for majoritarians. So any majoritarian candidate that can get 30%, even if all of the other candidates add up to 70%, will win. What that means is that it's likely that the ruling party will sweep almost all of the majoritarians. And that's going to be problematic. So, the big question in this election is, will the ruling party get a constitutional majority? And Ivanishvili's team is going to have to get half of the proportional vote and 12 majoritarians in order to have 51 members of parliament in in a 150 member chamber. So that's going to be a pretty heavy lift for them.
You know, during the Armenian parliamentary elections, which just ended, the question was the elections themselves. Will they be free, fair, representative, honest, open media? The question for the elections was the election. It wasn't the economy, it wasn't foreign policy. Number one question was the election itself. What's the number one question in Georgia?
I think well, it's hard to say. I think there's several different parts of that. One is there's a referendum quality to Georgian elections that people just want to find out what the real popularity of the opposition and the ruling party is. So there's that. The biggest issue is definitely the economy and unemployment, and I think people really do care very much about that, as I think the government has recognized. I don't know whether you've heard, but last night there were some videos that were released of prisoners being tortured in Georgian prisons, which has led to fairly significant demonstrations today. And I think that issue of sort of human rights and people feeling that they sort of have no personal security when facing the state. It's only 12 days before the election, and I think that in some ways this has sort of captured the zeitgeist, at least for those who are critical of the government, and I think it's significant enough that it may have some influence. I don't think that the topic is going to change from economy to the human rights, but I do think this has captured the interest of a lot of people, particularly young people.
The information dissemination process is largely through the internet, and the video you're referring to, or the media that is now during this election period open by law, accessible to all. Is that open media really being the sort of responsive, expressive medium that it's supposed to be?
Well, the Channel 9 particularly, that is more or less controlled by Ivanishvili, is a mouthpiece for his party. But the government-controlled media, frankly, is just so uninteresting that I think people watch Channel 9, even though it's biased, just to get a sort of an alternative view.
Even during this election period, the government-controlled media is uninteresting?
Fairly uninteresting. I mean, they're so used to doing the ribbon cutting that it's just, people feel like they're not getting much there. So I mean, I think people will tend to to watch a lot. People watch a lot of television here, and they particularly watch these programs with somebody from the government and somebody from the opposition yelling at each other. There are a lot of those on both sides, and so at a politically intense period like now, there's just a lot of TV watching that goes on, and people like to compare sources.
The forced openness, accessibility of the media during this election period, what are chances it will continue past the election period? That was an issue in Armenia as well. We haven't succeeded in getting an open media past the election period. How does it look? What are the chances in Georgia?
I don't know. My own personal theory that I've made up, I don't have any special information, but I think that the government is very worried about demonstrations, that the Ivanishvili is post-election demonstrations, or demonstrations that may start, election night or something like that. And they're quite nervous about that. The Ivanishvili has got a lot of observers. There's a lot of international observers from fairly shadowy organizations that nobody ever heard of, but everyone can guess who is funding. There's likely to be a whole lot of sort of videos and reports of problems, and that's natural, and that's as it should be. But the expectations have been set very high for the Georgian Dream Coalition, and they may not do as well as those expectations, and that may lead to demonstrations. My guess is that the government, if they have any intention at all of keeping the must carry, must offer broadcast going of the opposition stations cable, that it will be used as a negotiating element when talking about whether or not the streets will be cleared. So they'll say, you pull people off the streets, then we'll keep it going.
The Ivanishvili camp has said that they will abide by the judgment of the international observers. They will respect the verdict, so to speak. In Armenia, the international observers were very careful not to give a verdict. They described problems in detail, but did not come up with a concluding sentence intentionally. What do you think is going to happen?
Well, I've been involved in international election observing for 20 years, and I have never known a case in which international observers issue a judgment, ever. So if somebody knows of an example of a credible international observing organization that does that, let me know. But it's not their job. I mean, the way they see and I'm not sure what their job is other than, taking trips to interesting locations during interesting political periods. But, what they do is they say, that there were some problems, and an election was held and it was competitive, and they might go so far as to say a step forward, but certainly nobody in the country cares about that. What the people in the country want to know about is, were the people we voted for the ones that are going to be seated? And that's the one thing that international observers will never say. So when the ruling party says, well, you must accept the judgment of the international observers, there will be no judgment. Now, the ruling party, no matter what the internationals say, since irresponsibly they're probably going to issue their statements in English before they issue it in Georgian, the government will immediately say, see, the judgment is that it was a good election, and they will pick some text that say that, but it will not be conclusive. Much more important than that will be if there are any credible parallel vote tabulations, or whatever the comment by the domestic observers will be. I mean, credible domestic observers.
The other, and the last aspect of this for today at least, and I hope we can talk to you again before October 1 and certainly after, the last aspect of this that we haven't covered is the proxiness. Georgia often sees itself as the proxy playing ground for US-Russia conflict, competition. Is any part of that reflected in this election? Do they see this election as that, as a contest between Russia and the US?
Well, I'm not sure that Georgia does see itself that way. I mean, I think that in many ways Georgia has not does not realize that it is as independent as it is. It's a post-Soviet country, and it's a small country, and so I think people tend to think you hear sometimes, especially from older people, well, the decisions will be made in Washington or Moscow, but
very familiar, yes.
But I think you don't hear that from younger people, frankly, and I think that Georgia really is, it's going to decide. The people of Georgia are going to decide who they want to rule them within the confines of this election law. And so, for instance, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, Tom Mealy, was here a week ago, and, he said over and over and over again, look, whatever the Georgian people decide, that's the U.S. will deal with that. And so, I don't really think that that's maybe as big an element as it is sometimes played. Now, that said, I think Russia tries to make Georgia be an American proxy. And it's really more just that Georgia, takes a look around and sees the West as a more interesting partnership than others that it might entertain, and it has that prerogative.
Okay, perfectly clear that it's complex. Thank you, Mark Mullen from Tbilisi, a member of the board of Transparency International Georgia, and the person responsible for TBL Pod, which is a weekly rundown in English of things Georgian. We appreciate your talking to us, Mark, and I hope that we can talk to you again on CivilNet and follow the Georgian elections, and not just the elections.
Anything for you, Selfie.
Thank you. Thank you for watching CivilNet.